the founder and director of Classicalism, which is dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. And joining me is Donald Robertson. He is of the Plato's Academy Center of Fame, Modern Stoicism, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, How to Think Like Socrates. Well, you can probably list off your accolades better than I can, but suffice to say, welcome.
That's more than enough accolades, but I'm delighted to be here. I'm looking forward to it. There's nothing I like more than a bit of anger, to at least talking about it like I do. I find that one of the most interesting subjects to discuss. It's a colourful emotion, and it's interesting to write about and talk about.
Yeah, I think it's one of those issues that people can quickly and easily relate to it being an issue, throughout time. And some of us may deal with anger personally more than others, but even if you're not at the giving end, you might often be at the receiving end. So just it's not an emotion that people are going to escape in their lives. And considering how fundamental and universal it is, it's certainly worth our investigation. I'm sure the ancients would agree with us on that.
The ancients loved a bit of anger as well. As you know, Seneca's got an entire book about it. We've got a whole essay by Plutarch about it. It was a very important subject to them. But the irony is, Anya, that it's neglected by psychological research to some extent. I mean, there's a lot of research on anger, but not as much as there is on anxiety and depression, at least not in a kind of therapeutic or a clinical context. So some people have called it the kind of forgotten emotion from that point of view. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that anger by its very nature, at least when it's we tend to, we'll come back to this, but there's different forms of anger. But the kind of typical form of anger that we usually think of is other directed, so being angry with other people. And when we're angry with other people, we tend to really, one of the main characteristics of it is we shift our attention on them, and we tend to attribute the cause of the problem to them. So to caricature it a little bit, angry people don't tend to think they need therapy. If I was angry, I think you guys need therapy. There's something wrong with you. So they're kind of therapy dodgers and also self-help dodgers to some extent. And that's one of the reasons why we don't know as much about anger. And there hasn't been as much work on anger as there has been on anxiety and depression. But I think of that as a massive opportunity. I think of anger management as the royal road to self-improvement. Because it's neglected, there's more room for improvement there in many cases, I believe.
Well, it's really fascinating to think that it is such a fundamental thing, and yet not as discussed as much. One of the questions I always think that is worthwhile asking is: are we really angrier today? I mean, is anger becoming more and more of an issue?
Well, it's quite hard to quantify in some ways, partly because anger is very culturally dependent. It varies throughout history, the way that people express their anger to some extent, and in different cultures. And in fact, even there's quite a big gender divide. Men and women experience anger quite differently. So it's a little bit difficult to do a measurement, but in some ways, personally, I would say on the one hand, anger, or certainly its expression in violence and aggression, in some regards was more of a problem in the ancient world. Why would that be? Well, because of one simple fact: slavery. So in ancient Greece and Rome, if you're a slave owner, as many citizens and wealthy people were, and if you happen to be a slave, you can easily become a victim of somebody else's violence and aggression. And so we hear quite a lot of that in the ancient world, often about how slaves are mistreated by people who are very angry. So today we don't have quite as much control over other people as that, although with a few exceptions, we do have a lot of control over children. So sometimes children are the victims of violence and anger in modern society. But on the other hand, so in the ancient world, people had a lot more control over slaves and they could be more violent towards them. Anger is a problem in that regard. But today, we have this thing called social media, which seems to be a fantastic tool for rage farming and making people, if you wanted to make people really angry, social media is like a remarkable technology for doing that. And you might think, well, who on earth would want to make people angry? Well, I hate to break it to you, but throughout history, politicians. have thrived since the dawn of democracy. They've always been politicians demagogues who love nothing more than making people outraged about things. It's the coin of the demagogue to make people outraged about things, and that's nothing new. But in the ancient world, Anya, uh, if you wanted to hear a demagogue giving you a speech that would make you really angry, you had to leave your house to do that. Can you imagine? You have to walk all the way across Athens, right? And you had to go and stand in a field or on the side of a hill and listen to some guy getting really worked up and really angry, to make you really angry as well, so that you would do some impulsive thing. And I think if Socrates or Marcus Aurelius were to get in a time machine, they're getting Doctor Who's TARDIS, and they step out in the 21st century, one of the first things I think they would realize is that we no longer have to leave home. Since the invention of the printing press and the radio and television and the internet and social media, we now carry around demagogues in our pockets everywhere we go. People sit on the toilet watching Joe Rogan and these guys, and listening to someone shouting at them over their mobile phone. You can lie in your bed and be brainwashed by a demagogue now. So the influence of political rhetoric is far more pervasive in that sense than it was in the past. And insofar as it trades on fear and anger and playing and manipulating exploiting people's greed and stuff like that, that's a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly amplifies emotions and feelings, and like you say, it's something that can be pervasive. Though I do wonder, like the power of a mob. I mean, how angry that movement can get when people are all together and turning to violence. Is there something in humans that like to be angry? I mean, I can see from the politician's perspective, like you get somebody angry, you motivate them to act on your behalf. You motivate them to vote or to be a threatening force against your opponents. I mean, to see that incentive is very clear, and yet we still you still see people on either side of the spectrum getting hyped up purposefully. But do we like being hyped up on some level? Is it something
Yeah.
that gets us energized, I guess?
Well, okay, let's say some radical things, right? You and I, we all think of anger and talk about anger as an emotion, but there's nothing that people understand less, or we have a poorer understanding of than emotions, generally speaking. The folk psychology or the default understanding that we have of emotions is pretty sketchy in modern society, and kind of obviously incorrect in many regards. Um, so our understanding of anger might be kind of misleading, and we tend to have a very simplistic understanding of anger in modern society. That's definitely wrong, right? We're all kind of quite naive about how anger works. We tend to think of it as this kind of blob of energy that wells up within us, and we don't distinguish between different aspects of it, for example, or different forms of anger, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to make a radical suggestion in that in some ways, anger resembles a kind of coping strategy for dealing with other emotions like threat and anxiety and sadness and emotional hurt, for instance. So, anger, it's difficult to categorize, but it has this kind of voluntary aspect to it. That's slightly different from how we sometimes think about other emotions. Anger often seems like a kind of aggressive, simplistic attempt at problem solving. It's a way that we have of dealing with things. And it's addictive in a sense. We kind of get hooked on anger. And there are identifiable reasons for that. I mean, the simplest, and actually, when you explain it, it sounds crazy in a way, but we all do this. Anger is very simple. It's very crude in some regards. Anger, very simply, is a powerful distraction device. It hurls our attention outward towards the object of our anger, but that tends to distract us from emotional pain that we're experiencing inside. And anything on you that alleviates emotional pain tends to be kind of addictive. So whether it's a bottle of whiskey that numbs if you ask a girl out on a date and she rejects you, a bottle of whiskey might solve your problems temporarily, or smoking a joint, or just watching a movie to distract yourself. But you know what else? Anger can distract you from the emotional pain that you're experiencing. And we get hooked on that. It's called negative reinforcement in psychology. The feeling, the sense of relief that we have is addictive. But there's other reasons that we get hooked on it. Anger makes people feel temporarily more powerful.
Mm.
Often you'll hear people describing that. Psychologists sometimes call this the illusion of control. So often when people get angry, for a split second, maybe they're hurt by rejection and they feel helpless and powerless. I don't know what to do, and overwhelmed and bewildered. But do you know what solves all of those problems real quick and easy? Is anger. Like when you get angry, you suddenly think, I know what to do. Like if I yell at this guy or punch him in the nose or slam a door or something like that, feels like I'm doing something, and I can get people to listen to me then. So I kind of feel like I can have some control of my environment. But the problem with that is that usually we achieve that by kind of putting blinkers on and ignoring the longer term consequences of what we're doing. So I can get people to listen to me if I yell at them and stamp my feet and stuff like that. But do you know what? If I keep doing that, a bit like the boy that cried wolf, they're going to stop listening to me in the future. So anger specializes in achieving the opposite of what it wants in many cases. It's a paradoxical emotion. That's partly why it's a kind of illusion of control or an illusion of power that we get from it.
That's so fascinating. I never even thought of it that way. I'll be honest, I don't really get angry ever, but when I do get angry, I really don't like it because I'm like I can't think clearly. It all it does is it makes me like less conscious. But I wanted to bring it just if I can quickly to the ancients because you're saying we are not as modern people always so good at thinking about emotions, and one thing that I love in the ancient world is something as simple as having many different words for one thing that we have. So you think of, Aristotle defining different types of friendship rather than just us saying, here's a friend. Or all the, numerous ways of looking at the word love and it really showing a thoughtfulness and an aptitude for seeing the nuance in different types of emotions and relationships. But I find that in the ancient world, there's different terms for different types of anger as well. And,
Yeah.
when we think of the Iliad and we think of, rage, Sing muses the rage of Achilles, there are different types of rage and wrath and anger just within the kind of actions and also the motivating purpose of that anger.
Well, the ancients, like you yourself, Anya, were very wise, right? In many regards, right? Or at least the wisdom of the ancient world has been curated for us. We get the highlights.
Mhm.
And it's true. I think it's astounding. I don't say this lightly, although I do say it quite a lot. Like, it's astounding how sophisticated the understanding. I mean, Seneca's on anger is the obvious example, right? It's a remarkably nuanced I mean, it way beyond, and apologies to any psychoanalysts watching, but Seneca's understanding of anger is way beyond Freud's, as far as I can see it, and it's much more consistent with contemporary research on the subject. That is remarkable. This was 2,000 years ago. It should be unnerving to read it and think that. I mean, Marcus Aurelius. I've said this a gazillion times as well, but maybe not to this audience. In Meditations, Book 11, Chapter 18, Marcus Aurelius lists 10 distinct cognitive strategies for coping with anger. And they're pretty much all ones that would be plausible, at least, or have face validity to a modern researcher or a cognitive behavioral therapist. I used to teach therapists. If I stood in front of a room full of therapists with a flip chart, as I used to enjoy doing, and I said, hey guys, how many cognitive strategies for coping with anger can you name? I think they'd come up with 4, 5, 6. I really do think that they would struggle to come up with 10 distinct strategies. And Marcus Aurelius not only lists them, but he keeps returning to selections from that list, like he knows it by heart. I mean, I would go as far as to say that level of systematic understanding and classificatory understanding of a subject is not normal. It's indicative of somebody who's a professional researcher or a professional teacher of a subject. He's sat down and systematically itemized way beyond the level of understanding that somebody who's just using self-help would normally have. That's like a researcher's understanding of the subject. Now, that I find that kind of baffling in a way. I can only imagine Marcus Aurelius was not a psychological researcher, but maybe he knew a guy who was more of an expert on anger and had spent, many years teaching it and discussing it with students. It's like he's deriving it from something like that. But normally if we do self-help for anger today or therapy, clients will learn two or three strategies, maybe. Maybe they only need one, but they might learn like two, three, four. I've never met a guy who could list 10 distinct strategies that he knew by heart and was kind of an expert on. That's phenomenal. His level of, I guess you could say, emotional intelligence or his repertoire of coping strategies is way beyond anything as a therapist I've ever seen in any of my clients. So I don't believe in hyperbole normally, but in all honesty, I genuinely mean that. It's quite astounding. And so the distinctions between, I guess, the root of this, I'll try and be concise, but we can look at all these different strategies, but the root of the problem here is, like I said, our simplistic understanding of emotion. We have what's sometimes called a hydraulic model of emotion. The idea it's like pressure welling up within us and we can suppress it, or we can channel it, or we can vent it, or something like that. But the Stoics had a different understanding of anger. They made two distinctions that are absolutely foundational and are profound, even from the point of view of modern psychology. So the Stoics distinguish between involuntary and voluntary aspects of anger. They call the involuntary aspects the propathei, or the proto-passions. This already is way beyond the level of emotional understanding that the majority of people have today, right? And of course, they're right. There are involuntary aspects of anger and more voluntary aspects of it. And we don't want to get those mixed up, or we'd be in a complete mess, which is actually where we find ourselves today. The Stoics also understood that anger had cognitive components. That's the foundation of the cognitive revolution in psychotherapy, which happened in the 1950s. But the Stoics already understood, following on from Socrates actually, that there was a cognitive aspect to anger, that when we're angry, we don't just feel angry, we also think angry.
Mm.
Like, we have beliefs. I believe that you're a jerk when I'm angry, and I believe you deserve a punch in the nose. And I believe that you've done something that you really shouldn't have done. It's completely unreasonable and unjust. And so on. I have a bunch of different beliefs, which we can actually, there's probably like four or five typical categories of belief that we tend to find in angry people. And the Stoics pretty much understood this, which again is way beyond the level of emotional understanding that the average person has today.
Yeah, you think when we contemplate the different sort of lessons and takeaways from the ancient world, I think one of the ones that I really like, and this is so rooted in Stoicism, is just the habit, the tendency, the perspective of self accountability, and through the idea of like journaling and spending time to reflect at the end of every day, like how did I act, how could I do better, like, and to actually hold yourself accountable, as well as create like a goal to how you want to be, to always sort of be striving. Just that way of thinking, I can see how you would result in a more nuanced understanding of something that you feel like anger, by doing that.
Well, yeah, if everybody did that, therapists would be out of business. And maybe that would be a good thing. It's true, they had a systematic framework for self, in addition to all these techniques, he had a framework for doing it on a consistent daily basis and monitoring his improvement, which is also remarkable, and crucial, right? It's one thing having a bunch of techniques, it's another thing having a plan for how you're going to systematically implement them and review them over the long term. Like, that's a whole next level, like, in terms of the approach to self improvement. So I believe that the ancients, certainly the Stoics, also saw anger, dealing with anger, as a kind of ongoing thing for all of us. It's part of general self improvement. It's a fundamental challenge of life, to overcome our alienation from other people and replace that with a more compassionate, philanthropic attitude towards the rest of mankind, for instance. I mean, in a way, it's actually all summed up in the most famous passage from the Meditations, which is Book 2, Chapter 1, where Marcus says, every morning when I wake up, before I have my coffee, like, I tell myself, today you're going to encounter people that are meddling, treasonous, deceitful, and so on and so forth. So he's preparing himself in advance for all of the most annoying people that you could potentially encounter in life. And he sees this as a regular thing that he has to do in order to overcome his anger.
Yeah, just as like a side curiosity, and please excuse me if this is too much of a distraction or historical wonder, but do you think there's a potentiality that having been such military people, that the idea of anger would be something that they would encounter and need to harness in a way? Because you want your warriors to
Right.
certain amount of passion and gumption and be hyped up, but not to be
Do
completely
you
in
though?
control. So I mean, you imagine you've got like thousands of men, and Marcus Aurelius would have had been interacting with them on a regular basis, and
Yes.
been, hey, this guy's too angry. Well, this guy, like, how we need to get him, blah blah blah. Yeah, it's just a
The
thought.
optimum. Well, you're touching on two very important subjects, right? So one of them is that really the fundamental philosophical debate about anger, I think, is there such a thing as an appropriate amount of anger, right? So generally that view is attributed to Aristotle, although there's some debate about whether Aristotle himself ever actually meant this. But the idea is traditionally people think the Aristotelians, or certainly it's a popular view, that there's a healthy type of anger, or a moderate type of anger, or a righteous or justifiable type of anger. And
Homer.
then there's excessive or unhealthy anger. But the Stoics disagree with that. And actually, I think on their side, historically, Buddhists would be maybe the other main tradition that just think all anger is intrinsically unhealthy. So it's an interesting and nuanced debate, which we're probably not going to settle here. But it's one of the main questions I think people should be asking themselves at the event on Saturday is, what is there such a thing as healthy anger, and what does it look like? Now, just to give you a little teaser, right? Most people, the majority of people today, believe that there's such a thing as appropriate or healthy anger, right? If you then ask them, what does it look like? How do you gauge that? Their answer will typically be it's kind of based on how intense it is. So usually they judge it on the intensity or severity of the feeling. But that doesn't really work because arguably some of the most destructive forms of anger are low grade, simmering, passive aggressive anger towards other people, right? And intense bursts or flashes of anger sometimes might be quite harmless because they could be over quickly and they might not result in aggressive behavior. So judging it based on the intensity isn't really a very good guide as to whether it's healthy or not. That can potentially be quite misleading. And again, if you're more likely to think that if you have a naive view of anger where you just think it's like a build-up of pressure. But if you think, no, anger consists of certain attitudes and beliefs, then you might think, well, it could be quite a low intensity feeling, but you might still have quite unhealthy and irrational angry beliefs underlying it that could lead to problems, particularly over the longer term. Um, what you said about the military is interesting because I believe there's a passage where Marcus Aurelius actually says, who in a sense he was the commander in chief, basically, like he was a supreme commander of the military and stationed himself on the Danube frontier during the Marcomannic Wars. He said that for a legionary, anger is just as problematic as fear. Um, and one of the biggest, we're getting to real kind of historical, nerdy Roman Empire trivia, right? But one of the big advantages of the Roman army is that they had a highly disciplined, professional army. And normally, when tribal people fight, they kind of run at the enemy and scream and go, ah, like the Highland Charge in Scotland, we call it. And they kind of slash at people because you keep the enemy at a distance when you do that. But that tends to result in superficial wounds. And the Romans realized they had to get in close and stab people, which goes, if they really want to just become a killing machine, which is what the Roman legion was. So that goes against everybody's instincts, particularly when someone's really enraged or angry. They're more likely to break formation and slash with a weapon. And the Romans don't want that. They want you to be like a robot, like a killing machine. Who's going to be much more disciplined, stay in strict tight formation, and thrust your weapon in a highly controlled manner at the enemy. So for guys like Marcus Aurelius, they thought, no, anger isn't necessarily an asset in the military.
Um, Well, I think you brought up several points in which you and I easily could talk for hours about, because especially with regards to, the value of anger, whether venting versus like rational. I mean, there's so much, but before you get started, because I know
The value of anger is a great question. Like,
but what I wanted to say is you mentioned that we've got an event on Saturday, and we will be
yeah,
delving this thoroughly then. So maybe you could give everybody just a quick, brief overview of what our Saturday event is going to be like, because you and Casey have been putting together this really, really cool lineup that's like really comprehensive and also very like on the full spectrum of trying to understand it from really different perspectives. So I think that's going to be really exciting to really encapsulate it.
well, we just scratched the surface of anger here. Like, I hope people, we've whetted their appetites and they realize that there's a lot more. There are big, profound, serious questions about anger, both in terms of our individual psychology, our relationships, and society as a whole. It's a massive subject and one that's hugely neglected and where we could all really benefit from learning more. So the event that we put on, which is free of charge and recordings will be available, so it doesn't matter what time zone you're in, we're going to have probably well over 1,000 people registered to attend this event. We have some leading experts, world experts on the psychology of anger, philosophy, researchers, authors. I thought of it really as divided into three types of speakers. So we have a bunch of speakers who are philosophers and classicists who are going to talk about what Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, early Christian authors, Plutarch, and you look at like what mythology says about the nature of anger. So we'll talk about the classics, and then we have a bunch of evidence-based clinicians who are doing cognitive therapy, rational emotive behavior therapy, schema therapy, third wave, or what we call acceptance and commitment therapy. So all these different modern clinical perspectives, how they relate to anger and how they might be compared to what the ancient philosophers said. And then we've also got people talking about research. So we've got Andy Small, for example, talking about research on doing Stoic-based anger management in British prisons, like, the particular population. We've got Ray De Giuseppe, who's one of the leading experts on research on anger in cognitive behavioral therapy, talking about what evidence-based practice, the state of the art would look like. And really what this is exactly the sort of event that I'm passionate about and I wanted to see. And I hope that other people will benefit from it as well. I think really is a unique opportunity to do a real deep dive into the subject. And what I'm hoping is that when we talk about what the philosophers said, that some of the clinicians and researchers will see those talks as well and think, hey, there are some ideas that Seneca came out with or Marcus Aurelius came out with that might be worth doing more research on or could be integrated into cognitive behavioral therapy. Because for sure that's the case. I think anyone attending will see that there's untapped resources in ancient philosophy that have a lot of face validity, and could easily be integrated with modern research on cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting, and as you say, it's going to cover the full spectrum. And I know Nancy Sherman's one of our keynote speakers as well, and she's done
On
um,
Aristotle.
with soldiers and things, and so it's just to take that again, that whole spectrum of from the modern world back to the ancient, and seeing the value of how we can approach something that we all experience. So
Yeah,
with regards to details, I'll be sending out the link with everybody to
I
join.
think we should.
Yeah, I
We'll
don't know
send them the link.
how on
You
this.
don't know how to do it.
Do you know
We
how
can
to?
we can find it. I don't know how to do it. We'll do it. You guys can find it. I'm sure if you go and look at you've sent out the link maybe already in your
Yeah,
recent email.
go to Monday's Classical Wisdom. Can we
Yeah,
harness anger in the introduction? There is a link to that, but I will send out with this video the link as well. So if you're watching it in
yeah,
video, waiting for the email to go out afterwards, it will have the link in that
yeah.
as
And also, if you just go to the Plato's Academy Center Substack, you'll see there's loads of posts and explaining what the program is in detail and linking to the Eventbrite page and stuff like that. So, it shouldn't be difficult to find it. So it's a hot topic. We were talking earlier, Anya hasn't seen Adolescence on Netflix yet. So I know that there's going to be people who have seen that show and they'll kind of immediately realize that I feel like, if you wanted to make a case for why anger is a hot topic and relevant, just watch that. And like that's enough said. Like it gives a really dramatic example of why anger is such a problem in modern society and the way that it might affect adolescent boys in particular. Here's a bit of trivia, like maybe a nugget to end on. People are very concerned about adolescent boys and the manosphere. That's what this show is about. The research on anger management shows that they're actually one of the demographic groups that are most responsive. So they benefit. They're more likely to benefit, for example, than elderly women would be. Adolescent boys are this like are there's about like an 80% chance like that they're going to get significant benefits just from doing pretty simple anger management training. So they're the group that are easiest to help in a sense, and maybe ironically, perhaps most in need of help in some regards. So it's a big subject. This is a unique event. It's a real deep dive. There's something for everyone. It's everything that you ever wanted to know about anger, but were too enraged to ask about.
Well, the TLDR is join us Saturday at noon EST. Links to follow, and I have my homework apparently to watch this TV show before then.
Yeah,
And yeah, like I said, we'll have a full spectrum. I'll be starting us off, I believe, with mythology and anger. So we'll get the fundamentals from the classics to begin with, and yeah, it's gonna be really interesting. So I want to say thank you, Donald, for joining me now for our brief little foray into the world of anger. As you say, I think everyone will see that it is quite literally a very foundational, fundamental, and a deep well of investigation. And this life is not worth living if it's not being examined. Correct. So.
correct. And I think by the end of this, I think anyone they'll feel like they've really learned so much more about the subject. And you're right, Anya, you're kind of starting at the beginning, and that I think of you, Anya, as in a way you're going to be looking at the prehistory of anger, like where it all begins.
Well, really, I mean, when you think about the Iliad, we like to think of it as like the beginning of literary tradition, but really it's sort of the end of the oral tradition. So it's sort of like the fossilized belief system, and ideas and thoughts and values of societies going back even further. And the first word is rage in the Iliad. So I think it's very appropriate for me to start it off with that perspective.
I'll just mention one other similar irony. The opening sentence of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius concludes with a word that means freedom from anger. So the book opens with him praising his grandfather for teaching him how to overcome his anger.
Well, overcoming anger, I was just seeing we had a comment from somebody saying, "Hey, I got really angry yesterday. It took me a while to get calm." So yes, I think it will be really valuable to having the philosophical and the mythological perspective, but then also the straightforward cognitive um, behavioral tactics and elements that have worked from the ancient world onwards.
Looking
Uh,
forward to it.
Yep. With that, I will say thank you. Have a lovely day. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And please also let us know how you like this sort of Substack live feature because we're still getting used to it too. And your feedback is very valuable to us. And I want to say thank you to all of our crowds. So have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.